Welcome to our video on Chapter 1 of The Great Displacement by Jake Biddle. It examines how Hurricane Irma devastated the Florida Keys in 2017 and exposed systemic vulnerabilities that turned the storm into long-term displacement. Communities like Big Pine Key were left in ruins. Homes, businesses, and landmarks were destroyed, leaving residents like Patrick Garvey and longtime locals Corin and Glenn Fast uprooted. Roads, bridges, and evacuation routes failed, delaying emergency response. Biddle shows displacement wasn't caused by the storm alone. Bureaucratic failures and limited attention to climate risks left many without affordable paths to rebuild. This chapter highlights how fragile infrastructure, flawed policy, and ignored climate threats created lasting housing instability. We'll explore these failures, their societal impacts, and how we relate to those affected.
The low elevation of the Florida Keys, combined with sea level rise, are the underlying causes for the area's susceptibility to flooding. The lack of widespread, flood-proof infrastructure meant that most existing infrastructure, especially roads, were not designed to handle hurricanes and flooding. The violent nature of the flooding caused immediate damage to many existing roads. In addition, water often takes a long time to drain back out to the ocean after a major flooding or rain events. This results in prolonged periods where roads are partially or completely submerged in the area. The sustained forces on the roads caused by the flood waters put much strain on the pavement. This caused cracking and other further damages to the roads. The prolonged submersion of the roads creates severe transportation issues. Entire neighborhoods can become inaccessible for days or even months at a time. This issue is further exacerbated by the king tide. The king tide are extremely high seasonal tides that occur in the Florida Keys. Over the past decade, they have been increasing and causing longer periods of flooding, further disrupting connectivity in the Florida Keys. In order to combat this issue, the roads would have to be elevated. However, the money it would cost to raise the roads would not be more than the money saved from further damage prevention. This means financially, it doesn't make sense to raise the roads. The reason so much infrastructure failed under flooding was that most of it was designed in an inherently risky place. Many buildings and roads were built on coastlines and floodplains. This was justified in the past by old risk profiles which assumed climate stability. However, this assumption no longer holds and is the root cause of infrastructure failures.
Hurricane Irma was detrimental to the Florida Keys, not just because it destroyed homes, but because it exposed significant flaws in the U.S. government's ability to respond to natural disasters, and it corroded private citizens' faith in government. To start with, because of the remoteness of the Keys, aid and relief was delayed for days, leaving many people without electricity, clean water, and supplies. A lot of this has to deal with the Florida Keys' geographic situation as compared to the rest of Florida. It sits below the southern tip of Florida, and a lot of the roads in and out are actually bridges over the water. And because of the strong winds and tides that the hurricane brought in, a lot of these roads and bridges were wiped away, which made it a lot harder for FEMA to bring in supplies. And it made a lot of people go without electricity, without water supplies, because everything got damaged. The debris from the houses got in their water supplies, so the water was undrinkable. Their food spoiled because there was no electricity, and all the food in the fridges was bad. So they were really left basically by themselves to deal with the aftermath. And unfortunately, the response only got worse as time went on. And a lot of that had to do with bureaucratic hurdles and red tape that delayed FEMA assistance, especially with poor residents. In order to get FEMA assistance, you have to file an insurance claim, apply to FEMA, you have to be inspected, and then you have to apply to the Small Business Administration, and finally you'll get a FEMA decision. And all of these steps, especially with how remote the Keys were, made it a lot harder for residents to be able to get assistance that they needed. A lot of these people practice sustenance, whether it was in their farming or their businesses, and they did not have a surplus of of money, of food, of supplies. And so when their only livelihood was taken away from them by the hurricane, they didn't have the ability to rely on other things. And this situation really exacerbated the difference in socioeconomics of the area as well. As you can see on the map shows the difference between median household income and mean household income. So the greater the difference between those two numbers, the more social inequality exists, because the mean is the higher, richer people is dragging the mean way higher than the median. So in Monroe County at the bottom, it's obviously a very dark color, and that's because the mean household income is $114,000, while the median household income is only $73,000. So that big difference made it a lot harder for certain people to be able to get assistance, and because of that, a lot of people who had more money could either rebuild really quickly, didn't have to rely on the FEMA assistance, or could pay to get them some processes quickened up, which would allow for them to be better off in the long term, while there were a lot of really poor residents who were not able to get their assistance because of their lower socioeconomic status. So FEMA and the federal government's response to this strategy eroded the trust the citizens had in their government. And after this is a common occurrence as more hurricanes and more natural disasters sweep through the nation.
The Florida Keys began with very little human contact. Only some indigenous people and hunter-gatherers would visit the islands occasionally. However, a businessman by the name of John Simonton purchased Key West for $2,000 and traveled there to create the next big port city. This would be the beginning of the population of the Florida Keys. The culture of the Keys began with working people such as businessmen, farmers, fishermen, wreckers, etc. The Florida Keys provided many conditions and resources that allowed it to become one of the most richest cities in Florida at the time. But how could such a successful city filled with hardworking people end up being too risky to even live in? Infrastructure and the environment. Poorly designed roads on already low elevation caused flooding to be devastating. For example, the old railroad connecting the Keys to the mainland was so heavily damaged by the 1935 Labor Day hurricane that a new commercial highway was built. That caused a major cultural shift, as now many older people on the mainland began to see the Keys as a vacation destination, and property values began to skyrocket because of it. What was previously an economic hub for opportunity became more of a vacationer's paradise. However, the cultural shift caused by the poor roads and natural calamities would prove to be more devastating than anybody ever imagined. Hurricane Irma destroyed so many residencies and businesses that people who had lived there since they were born were now deeming the Keys to be too risky to stay at. Hundreds of families left the Keys because of the outweighing of benefits and the Keys provided. Because of natural calamities taking advantage of poor infrastructure, the population of the Keys began to be displaced, and what used to be a land of opportunity and wealth became a place full of displaced people and instability.
When we think about displacement, we often focus on the physical losses, the destroyed homes, the broken roads, the flooded neighborhoods. But for the people living through it, the psychological impact can be just as devastating. Jake Bill shows how communities facing constant flooding and infrastructure failure aren't just losing property, they're losing their sense of home. Such disasters are so traumatic that they can push people to leave the place that holds their home, community, and cultural ties. In Chapter 1, Bill explores the experience of Connie and Glenn Fast after Hurricane Irma. For them, it was an immediate decision to leave for the mountains of North Carolina after spending almost 50 years in the Keys. Bill explains that the life they built was something unique to the Keys, the kind of life that couldn't exist anywhere else, completely tied to the city marathon and the community around it. In fact, they had remained in the Keys through several major storms, including Hurricane Wilma in 2005, which brought 5 feet of water to their little island and totaled 3 of their cars. Even through this, they held onto the Keys, but when Irma came, the choice became much easier. Glenn Fast has stated, "That was it for us," indicating that they felt that the risk and fear of another potential disaster was enough to justify leaving their home of 50 years. The displacement that results from these tragic disasters splinters the communities within these areas, leaving permanent psychological scars. Deborah McConaughey, a church rector from Marathon, shares the story of Mike, a longtime church member and vital part of the community, who was forced to evacuate by bus and is now gone. She reflects, "You have to ask yourself, do you ever recover from something like this?" These stories show that the trauma of displacement extends far beyond physical damage, leaving emotional wounds and a sense of loss that can persist long after people have left their homes.
The housing shortages that people struggled in Keys, Florida due to Hurricane Irma was an extremely devastating reality. The storm had not only destroyed large homes, but also the livable boats and apartment complexes of many lower-class Keys residents, which had been vital sources of affordable housing prior. To add on to this devastation, due to flawed governmental oversights like the de facto cap that had been placed to limit the number of building permits, many were stuck homeless and unable to rebuild. As described by Jake Biddle, this housing crisis became like a game of musical chairs, where only the highest bidders could end up with a seat. It's hard to imagine the extent of the hardships faced by these islanders, especially as someone who hasn't struggled much with housing in my lifetime. But when hearing about their situation, the first thing I thought of was the 2008 housing crisis, which also left many people without homes. Likewise, the 2008 housing crisis was partially induced by the government, mainly monetary policy and lack of regulatory oversight. Ultimately, in 2008, my parents had to foreclose on their home. As a result, they got stuck in deep financial turmoil and struggled to find easy places to stay. In a way, it also became like a game of musical chairs. My parents described this time in their life as one of the hardest, but they were ultimately able to recover, which was very sadly not the case for much of the Keys community, who was forced to move elsewhere. In part, because of the 2008 housing crisis, I strongly empathize with the Keys community and all those facing homelessness and housing instability.
Save on everything at Christmas in July. HHH, everything's on sale at HH Greg. LG 42-inch TV $489. 32-inch LCD TV $299. HDTV $489. During Christmas in July, Panasonic Blu-ray $99. Everything's on sale at HH Greg. July. HH Greg at Christmas in July. HH Greg. LCD TV $299. HH Greg. Save on everything. HH Greg. Panasonic Blu-ray $99. HHH Greg. Everything's on sale at Christmas in July.